Hey folks, welcome to our second session for nutrition with the Redmond Cycling Club and RTS. I am Rick. I'm with the board for Redmond Cycling Club, and we're here to talk about nutrition. I've got a number of folks online, so why don't you introduce yourself, Oren, Kathie, and Bill. Oren, why don't you start first?
Hi, I'm Oren Eamon, and I'm leading the RAMROD Training Series this year. And I've been riding bikes for many moons. Though at the moment, I'm on injured reserve.
Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathie Beals. I'm a registered dietitian and a certified specialist in sports dietetics. And I'm going to be your nutrition guru for this little podcast.
And then Bill, you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, I'm Bill Pence. I'm just hanging around briefly before I go out on my ride. I thought I'd take a look and see. I've been with the club for a long time, doing this and that.
Cool. Awesome. So we are 2 months into Redmond Training Series. Hopefully, folks have been participating with the RTS. We have the Facebook group that we post our weekly rides on. So, Oren, let me ask you, how are things going with RTS?
Things seem to be going pretty well. The riders seem to be enjoying the routes I've been picking. They're trying to make things different every week. At the moment, we're up to about just over 70 miles on whichever weekend day I find feels better weather-wise. Last weekend was 69.9 miles, which I made 67 of it myself. It spat rain at me, so I sort of headed for home.
Nice.
But yes, it's going very well. And the riders are posting very nice videos to the Facebook page. Well worth looking at.
Cool. And so let me turn it to you, Kathy. Where should folks be then in terms of their training? And again, they're 2 months into their RTS training. Ramrod is going to be at the end of July. What should folks be looking at from a sports nutrition perspective? Again, this is building off the previous discussions we had on a couple of months ago.
Right. So I showed this slide in our last podcast, and we focused on that. And the one thing that you might notice is a little bit different is that the carbohydrate piece of the pie has increased a little bit. So as you ramp up your physical training, as you increase your mileage, and so you may not only be increasing your duration or your mileage, but also increasing your intensity a little bit. So too should you be increasing your calories because you're expending more calories. So you need to replace those calories that you're expending. And as we talked about last time, since the majority of what you are burning for fuel while you're riding is carbohydrate, you should be upping your carbohydrate intake. So I believe on our last slide, I had 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight carbohydrate. Now you'll notice that it's 8 to 10. So your carb intake should increase directly proportional to your intensity and duration of your rides. Notice that your protein will stay about the same, fat will stay about the same. So as you start increasing your total calories to match increasing your energy intake to match your energy expenditure, a lot of that increase in energy intake should come from carbohydrates.
Is the upper balance this time still at 10 grams per kilogram though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Pretty much that 10 is where you're going to, as you start getting probably in the last month or so before the ride, and depending on the upper limit of your ride, and Oren, maybe you can chime in and tell me what the longest training ride you'll have the riders do. But generally speaking, you don't need to start getting up into the 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight until you're riding probably close to 120 miles.
Yes, that is about the longest we will do.
Yeah. And so on those days, you could go up to 10 to 12 grams per kilogram body weight on that day. But otherwise, the 8 to 10 is going to be ample.
And this
And
is terms of numbers for, is it 24 hours before your ride, or how should folks think about the separation of ratios here?
No, so remember we talked about last time we talked about the importance of carbohydrate availability. And so you want to make sure that you have that carbohydrate available on the day that you're using it. So you'll want to be, I mean, you could sort of start the night before, making sure that you're having a good carbohydrate rich meal the night before, especially if you're going to get up and do your ride first thing in the morning. But then you should be fueling throughout the day, certainly during your ride, as well as then throughout the day to match the calories that you expend during the ride.
Cool. Okay, so for this section, actually, we've gone through kind of the building blocks of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. So this section, we're actually going to cover some user questions or cyclist questions from the group. So actually, let me do that. Let me start asking questions. Let's just go through the process of answering these questions here, Kathie.
Sure.
So first question, I sweat a lot. How do I know if I need more sodium and should I be using salt tablets and electrolyte drinks?
So let's talk about hydration again. And I talked a little bit about hydration on the last podcast, but we actually got cut short for time. So hydration sort of took a back seat. So we can focus a little bit more on hydration in this podcast. And so you can see the signs of suboptimal hydration. These are things that you might experience, which might clue you into the fact that you are not hydrating adequately. So early fatigue during workouts, slower recovery. You might see a decrease in appetite, weight fluctuations. A lot of times people will say, gosh, I'm losing over the course of a week, I'm losing and gaining 5 to 7 pounds. And they don't realize, well, that's water weight. So that's telling me that you're sweating out a lot of fluid and you might be replacing that fluid or you might not be replacing that fluid. So if you see weight fluctuations, especially over the short term, that's an indication. Lack of focus and concentration, headaches, that's very much a sign of dehydration. Constant thirst, a constant feeling that your mouth is dry, and especially living in the Pacific Northwest where there's lots of moisture in the air, if your mouth is dry, that's a good indication that you're dehydrated. The fluid recommendations you can see here, about 14 to 18 fluid ounces in the hour to an hour and a half before exercise. And then during exercise, ideally you want to assess your sweat rate and replace at that level, but that's hard for a lot of people to do. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And so a good rule of thumb is about 4 to 6 fluid ounces every 15 to 20 minutes. You don't necessarily have to drink that frequently, but oftentimes people tolerate smaller doses of fluid versus larger bolus doses of fluid. So one of the ways that you can check your hydration status, a lot of times people will look at urine color. And the problem with looking at urine color is that a lot of things other than your actual hydration status can affect urine color. So ideally, they say, well, urine color should be around the color of lemon juice. That's why I have the subliminal image here of lemons, right? So somewhere between 1 and 2 is ideal urine color. But the problem is, a lot of things, like I said, can affect urine color. One of the most notorious things to affect urine color is the B vitamin riboflavin. So riboflavin will actually turn your urine more around a level 4. Has nothing to do with hydration status. It's just that riboflavin, flavus actually means yellow in Greek. And so it actually has a yellow tint to it. And lots of sports products, energy drinks, those kinds of things have extra riboflavin in it. And it'll only take slightly above the RDA of riboflavin to turn your urine a pretty neon yellow color. So the other thing is if you're doing a really high protein diet, your urine's going to turn this color. So kind of like a brownish color because of the nitrogen. So I'm not a big fan of using urine color as an indicator of fluid status. Better to actually weigh yourself before your ride and after your ride. You should have a minimal, if you're hydrating appropriately, you should have a very minimal weight loss. So you can look at your percent body weight change. So measure your pre-body weight right before you get on your bike. Weigh yourself after you get off your bike. Obviously, you need a digital scale because most people are not, especially if they're hydrating well, they're not going to be losing even a pound, right? It's going to be in the decimals. So that can give you a sense for what your body weight change is. And as long as you are within about +1 to -1%, and again, you can kind of use the urine color, but I really like the body weight change. You're well hydrated. Minimal dehydration, -1 to -3%, and then you can go down the list from there. Generally, as long as you have not lost more than 2% of your body weight as water, you're hydrating pretty well. So the weight check is a good way to assess your hydration status and assess how well you are hydrating on the bike.
Is there anything to
Okay.
be said about if you're gaining weight on the bike? Are you overhydrating
So,
or?
yeah, if you are gaining weight on the bike, then you are likely overhydrating.
You
So,
have some
and
people who like to hydrate to the level of peeing clear, which seems like might be too much.
yes, yes. And the
Hyponatremia.
problem about doing, I'm sorry, Bill.
Hyponatremia.
Exactly. The
Eventually.
I've
problem
done
with
that to
doing
myself.
that, yeah. So the problem with doing that is that what happens is, especially if you're only drinking water, which is hypotonic to plasma, then what'll happen is you'll dilute the sodium in your blood, and you can actually wind up with hypo, low, natremia, nate referring to sodium, emia referring to blood. So low sodium in the blood. So it's not so much that you've sweated out a lot of sodium, but you're replacing a lot of water and you're basically diluting the sodium in your plasma. And hyponatremia can have similar signs and symptoms and consequences to dehydration, although it's actually slightly more dangerous, believe it or not. People have actually died from hyponatremia. So it's not to say you can't die from dehydration, but the effects of hyponatremia happen a lot more quickly. And you progress to a state of being slightly overloaded with water to death pretty quickly. So you want to be very careful with that. You mentioned the sodium thing, and since we're talking about hyponatremia, I put together a little slide that talks about a few things. So there's a lot on this slide. Let me walk you through a few things. So first of all, over in the upper right-hand side here, I want to orient you to the table here. And when we talk about electrolytes, people sort of glom onto sodium and potassium. And the reason that for that is when we look at sweat, so if we look down here, if we look at the composition of sweat, the two key electrolytes in sweat are sodium and potassium. But that's not to say that sodium and potassium are the only electrolytes. In fact, there are a lot of electrolytes: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarbonate. Amino acids actually function as electrolytes. But the primary electrolytes lost in sweat are sodium and potassium. So those are the ones that we tend to focus on. What's interesting is that while potassium losses can be somewhat substantial, they are sort of maintained at the same rate. And we don't tend to see a lot of hypokalemia as a result of excessive sweat losses. Whereas we can see hyponatremia as a result of excessive sweat and sodium losses. So there isn't a standardized amount of sodium that all endurance athletes need. It's very highly individualized. And so that's why I have over here, sodium needs are highly variable. And obviously, the amount of sodium that you need to replace during exercise is going to depend on the amount of sodium you're losing in your sweat during exercise. And the amount of sodium lost in sweat is highly variable from person to person. There are people that lose a lot of sodium. They sweat a lot. They lose a lot of sodium in their sweat. And we refer to them, it's a very technical term. We call them salty sweaters. So, and you can kind of identify those people. Like I'll be watching a professional basketball game and I'll see on the basketball players that around their face and their temples, there's like white crystals, right? So that's where they've sweated out sodium, and then the water has evaporated, and what remains on the skin is the sodium, right? And so you can see that. So some people are very salty sweaters. They lose a lot of sodium. Some people are light salt sweaters. They don't lose a lot of sodium. Unless you actually have the sodium content of your sweat measured, it's hard to really know where you fall. But you can kind of look at your sweat, especially after it evaporates. Do you see a residue of salt on your face, around your temple, wherever you tend to sweat a lot? Is there a residue of salt? You might be a salty sweater.
I've noticed
So the
that,
rate,
sorry,
okay.
I've noticed in some of like the shorter rides that I do, usually obviously from a sweat perspective, you're sweating, but I've noticed on a couple of ramrods at the end of the day, my helmet is basically caked in what you're talking about with the salt and the sweat. Um,
Mhm.
so the other thing you mentioned as well is sweat test. Do you recommend people to take a sweat test in this case to find out their sodium levels?
Generally speaking, no. I mean, it's something that you could do. You'd have to find a lab that would do it. And most likely, you're going to have to find a university that has a human performance lab that's willing to do it. So I would say, you want to shoot for a range of about 250 to 700 milligrams per hour. Doing 700, you're probably not going to exceed your like you're not going to cause yourselves any problems by doing that. Most people probably don't need all the way up to 700, probably 250 to 500 per hour is going to be adequate. One of the things that to note, though, is that when you start getting higher sodium concentrations in your drinks, in your gels, you're going to taste it. It's going to be very salty, and that can be unpalatable for a lot of people. So the other thing that I put on here was a little chart highlighting some different sports foods and then the sodium content per serving. So you can look at things like honey stinger chew. It has about 80 milligrams of sodium in a 1.8 ounce bag. So you can kind of see Gatorade. A lot of your sports drinks are going to be around 160 upwards to 200 milligrams for about a 12-ounce bottle, right? So most of these are going to be at the lower end of the range, right? Now you start getting for my salty sweaters, especially if they're not vegetarian, I say, take a couple of beef jerky sticks and munch on those, right? A lot of athletes like V8. I'm not a fan, but that's another pretty decent sodium rich drink. Pretzels are always a great snack to snack on, 250 minutes. So it gives you an idea of what the sodium concentration are of different foods. Obviously, you can get some electrolyte things to add to your water, and just look at the amount on the package. Most people are not going to need more than 700 milligrams per hour. They're just not. So
So a couple things I also wanted to ask or touch upon is, I guess this is maybe more of a personal preference, is water versus actually something in your drink. Um, do you recommend having stuff within Gatorade or electrolytes within your hydration as well, or is just water with food additional to it going to be the best way to go in this case, though?
it really depends on meeting your needs for carbohydrate, because when you think about it, it's like during the ride, you're going to need to replace carbohydrates, fluid, and electrolytes, right? How you manage to do that is really up to you, right? So if let's say that I need 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour and I have a sensitive stomach, and then I also need 500 milligrams of sodium per hour and I need some fluid. If I have somebody with a sensitive stomach, I'm going to say use a sports drink and add some electrolytes to it. Because then you're getting the carbs, the fluid, and the electrolytes all in that sports drink, and you're not overloading your belly, right? If I've got somebody that's like, oh, I can eat anything, it's no problem, then I'll say, okay, great. Have a sports drink, maybe add some electrolytes, and have a bar, like a Cliff Bar or whatever bar you happen to like, right? Or have a banana and sports drink, right? For most people, it may be difficult, although I have had some athletes that have two water bottles, and one of them they'll have a sports drink in, and the other one they'll have water, or like a flavored water, like a Propel, and electrolytes in it. And they'll just alternate between the two of them. But it's all about making sure that you get the right amount of fluid, the right amount of carbs, and the right amount of sodium. And then how you mix and match your gels, your chews, your bars, your hydration drink is really up to you and what your gut can tolerate.
I also wanted to touch upon something before, just to make sure we're on the same page. Is the previous chart that you had is if you are hydrating correctly, you're probably going to be losing weight. But we would probably have folks want to overhydrate in a sense versus underhydrate, right? So if you're gaining weight, it's okay. We'd rather you overhydrate from a small percentage perspective, or are you saying overhydration is continuing to be bad?
Yes. Because remember, actually, let me go back. Oops, there was a question on beer. So remember that minimal dehydration. So 2% of your body weight lost is water is kind of the cutoff. You don't want to lose more than 2% of your body weight is water. Okay. So Rick, I want you to humor me. All right.
Yep.
So I want you to figure out what in pounds, what is 2% of your body weight? So just take your body weight,
Yep.
multiply it by 0.02.
Yep.
Tell me what that is.
5 pounds.
5 pounds. So think about that. How often have you ridden where you've lost 5 pounds?
Not much.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a fair amount of dehydration that you
Yes.
have to get to, and you're not going to see decrements in performance until you hit about 2% of your body weight lost as water.
Yep.
So I would rather see a slight deficit, so maybe 1%. So maybe you lose a pound, maybe you lose a pound and a half versus gaining weight.
Yep.
Because hyponatremia is more dangerous than mild dehydration.
Okay, interesting. Because you're right. If I'm gaining 5 pounds on the bike, then yeah, I probably had a very good meal after, right after the ride.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. You kind of hinted on the next question because that was a question folks are asking. Can I have a beer?
Can you have a beer? Yeah. So I pulled a picture and I actually found an article, a scientific systematic review of beer. And so this is very interesting to me as well. I'm not a beer drinker, so I liked your question because I thought, well, I don't know. Let's see what kind of research is out there on beer. And I was actually surprised to see that there was this systematic review that was published in 2021, so not too long ago, right? 4 years ago. And they actually found that drinking a light beer, right? A light beer, actually, because it has calories, it has carbs, it has fluid, and there is sodium in it, that it actually aided in rehydration. So there you go. And you'll see down here it says adding sodium to alcoholic beer may improve rehydration, but palatability may decrease, probably not going to taste so good. So if consumed in moderation, things are largely unaffected by beer. So, but the caveat here is that you want to stick with light beer and one. as far as rehydration.
And not also on the bike as well. We're not advocating
No,
for biking and drinking. So
that does not improve performance. The other thing you also want to be cognizant of is that, and it's probably not going to be an issue if you're doing, let's say you do a long training ride or after the RAMROD, right? You want to treat yourself to a beer. That's fine. One of the things that we do know is that alcohol does negatively affect glycogen resynthesis. So if you're, let's say that you're having a beer and you're having a beer in the evening or 2 beers in the evening and you're planning to get up early and go for a long ride the next day, probably not the best bet to do that at that point because alcohol does impede particularly liver glycogen synthesis. So you kind of want to be careful about that and choose your occasion to drink beer wisely.
After the event.
After the event, when you're not going to be riding first
You're
thing in
not
the
training for
morning.
anything yet.
Yep, treat yourself.
And no light beer. There's no point.
Yeah.
Well, we are known to have the odd beer and nice salty chips afterwards as well. So
There you go. Perfect.
okay, cool. Next question. So I'm eating breakfast before RTS rides, but I feel bloated while I'm on the bike and I'm eating cereal, yogurt, and then some fruit. Am I eating too much and should I drink more?
Yeah. So, I think, let me look at what my next slide is. Yeah. So one of the things that I want to address this question by talking a little bit about fueling and glycogen storage. And I think I touched on this on the last podcast, but I don't think I went into depth. And this concept is key for understanding what you need to eat when, and I think it's been a great teaching tool as I've worked with athletes who panic about, I'm going to train first thing in the morning and I don't want to get up at 4 a.m. to eat a big meal. What do I do? So before I answer that question, I want to just review for everybody where we store carbohydrate, that is glucose. And remember, when we store glucose, we store it as glycogen. And there are two primary places that we store glycogen, the liver and the muscle. This is showing your upper arm, right? But obviously as cyclists, we'd be focusing on our legs, right? But so pretend this is a leg. So we store glucose as glycogen in our liver and in our skeletal muscle. Okay. Now look over at this picture here, this little cartoon. The glycogen, so the glucose that we store as glycogen in the liver is there to support our blood. So when our blood glucose starts to get low, the glycogen in our liver is broken down and it's released into the blood. And then once the glucose gets into our blood, it can go to our brain or it can go to our muscles. Okay. So when we think of liver glycogen, I like to think of that as our reserve of glucose for our blood and then for our brain. The glycogen that we store in our muscles is only for use by our muscles. Once glucose gets taken up by the muscle and it's stored as glycogen, it can be broken down to glucose in the muscle, but it can never leave the muscle, right? It's stuck right there in the muscle, okay? And for anybody out there watching this that's really into biochemistry, it's all because of this. There is an enzyme called glucose 6-phosphatase, and it is in the liver, not in the muscle. So glucose that's stored as glycogen in our muscle stays there. The reason that I bring that up is if I eat a carbohydrate-rich meal at night for dinner, and then I have a carbohydrate-rich snack before I go to bed, and I synthesize glycogen in my liver and in my skeletal muscle, when I wake up in the morning, all of the glycogen that I've stored in my skeletal muscle, in my quadriceps and in my hamstrings will still be there. It's there, hasn't gone anywhere. Not unless you're a really crazy sleepwalker, right? And you go for long runs in your sleep, right? It's there in your muscles. The only thing that's been depleted overnight is my liver glycogen, because overnight my brain's still functioning. So I'm still releasing glucose from my liver to support my blood and my brain. Okay. So when I get up in the morning, and let's say that I'm going to go out for a long ride at 8 in the morning, I don't have to worry so much about fueling my muscles. It's all still there from the night before. So all I'm really trying to do is top off my liver glycogen. And honestly, that can be done with a small meal. So in answer to your I feel bloated question, it's probably because they're eating too much. So scale it back. Scale it back. And I would also like to look at what cereal you're eating. If you're eating a really high fiber cereal, especially if it's one that's high in soluble fiber, which gets fermented and tends to cause gas, I would, think about doing Cheerios, right? Something that's still fairly healthy, and it's full of vitamins and minerals, but it's lower in fiber. It could also be that if you're doing milk with your cereal, maybe you're a little lactose intolerant and the milk is causing the gas and bloating. So I would scale back breakfast a little bit, focus on something that's a little more easily digestible. And honestly, all you're really trying to do is top off your liver glycogen, because as long as you have fueled properly the night before, everything's still there in your skeletal muscle.
So what about if, in terms of the morning breakfast meal, is there a recommended, like, should they continue to eat protein with their meal? Even though, as you mentioned, that you probably want something that's more easily digestible.
Yeah, so I think I showed this one last time. And typically you do want to have slightly lower protein, lower in fat, and higher in carbohydrate. The reason being that, remember, what we're going to be burning on the bike is about anywhere from 50 to 70% carbohydrate, depending on the intensity, and the rest fat. Protein is not really going to be used on the while you're riding unless you start depleting carbohydrate. So, and protein takes longer to digest and absorb. So it's going to delay things leaving your stomach. It's going to delay gastric emptying, absorption. And so you're more apt to have GI distress when you start riding if you have something high in protein for breakfast. Same thing with something high in fat.
Well, let me actually get the next question for us here. Okay, Kathie. So just a follow up on that is someone's asking, what about the night before? Is eating a midnight snack okay? And what should they be eating?
Yeah. So eating a midnight snack is great. Probably want to keep it pretty light. Sometimes if people eat something really big right before they try to go to sleep, it can affect their sleep. And obviously sleep is super important too. So, and the other thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to stay within your calorie needs. So as long as you're not overdoing it on your calorie needs, then having a midnight snack is great. Having something that is, again, rich in carbohydrates, low in fat, moderate in protein is going to be a good bet. And something that digests well for you. And isn't going to cause you to have GI distress or make you feel too full. Rick, I think you're muted.
My apologies. Next question is, I think you kind of touched on this, but they're asking, if I'm waking up early for 6 a.m. rides, what's the best thing to eat that is quick and still gives me energy? I think you kind of touched on that one.
Yeah. I mean, My go-to is always a banana and, maybe half a bagel with peanut butter, or I've also been known to, I love graham crackers, so I'll do like a graham cracker with peanut butter on it, or make like a graham cracker sandwich. Or my favorite is just, especially if I'm rushed for time, I do graham cracker, peanut butter, sliced banana, another graham cracker. I love to munch on that. But honestly, it's going to be, you want it to be carbohydrate rich. And it needs to be something that you're familiar with and that settles well with your stomach. And obviously that varies for everybody. I've known people that when I used to race triathlons, I would stick with my bagel, peanut butter, banana, and or graham crackers. And I would have a friend and he'd show up with a breakfast burrito. And I'm like, I don't know how you can do that and then get in the water and swim.
Yeah, each
But
their own. Yep. Yep.
yeah, so you really have to know yourself. And then the others, it seems intuitive to me, but it never hurts to say it. You want to experiment with those things during training.
Yep.
Don't on the morning of the ram ride go, I think I'm going to try this
Yep.
today. It's like, that is not the time to be experimenting. That's what training is for. Just as you're training your body, you need to experiment with different foods before, during, figure out what is going to be the sports drink or the bars or the gels or the goos or whatever it is that works well for you during a ride, and try those things out during training.
Yep. I think like one of the things you mentioned is the carb availability. Yep. Some folks can absorb carbs faster than other folks, and trying to do that during ramrod, introducing a new variable is always an interesting experience. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
So let's focus. We've been talking about before nutrition. Some of these next questions are really for recovery and after nutrition. So after a 10-hour ride, I usually don't feel like eating much. What's the recovery meal or shake that gets me the nutrients I need without being too heavy?
Yeah. So one of the things that people used to get really concerned about is, gosh, I need to eat within 2 hours after my training. I've got to do that. And it turns out that, in fact, the only time you really have to worry about eating immediately post training, and within 2 hours, is if you plan to go out and train again in the next 8 hours. So, and I would say probably for most of your athletes, that's not the case, right? They're going to do their training ride, and then they're probably not going to ride again for 24 hours. So when I have an athlete that says, I'm just not really hungry right afterwards, what I will tell them to do is, well, at least make sure that I get them a sports drink with a little extra sodium. So munch on some pretzels, have a half of a Cliff Bar or whatever bar you like, and have some sports drink so that you've got some carbs, a little bit of carbs, a little bit of fluid, and just sort of have that. And then when you're hungry in a couple of hours to have dinner or lunch, whatever time of day you're riding, then eat your meal then. But don't get so worked up about, I've got to eat right after I get off the bike, because you really don't. Especially if you've got more than 8 hours before your next training bout.
So maybe this is fact or fiction, but I've heard, again, you can correct me if wrong, is like the after the 30 minutes after an intense ride, that's when your body can absorb the most protein or carbs.
Yeah, fiction.
Cool.
So I wished I had made a slide for this. I should have shown it, but there was a beautiful study that was done by Dr. Louise Burke, who is out of Australia. She's sort of I think I mentioned her before. She's the goat of sports nutrition. And she does these amazing research studies that are super applied and super practical. And it turns out that glycogen resynthesis, the rate of glycogen resynthesis is highest within 2 hours after exercise. And then it starts to slow down. But when you look, and what she did is she took a group of, two groups of athletes, and I think it was actually a randomized crossover design. So they were the same athletes, and in one situation, they ate within 2 hours and then continued to eat over the course of 24 hours. And it was the same amount of carbohydrate. So let's just say it was 200 grams. So in one group, they got, of that 200 grams, they got 50 grams within 2 hours and then spread the rest out over a 24-hour period. The other group got the same 200 grams, but they spread it out over 24 hours. They didn't worry about loading heavy in that 2 hours after. And at the end of 24 hours, they found that glycogen resynthesis, the amount of glycogen synthesized, was exactly the same, regardless of whether you did it really fast in the first 2 hours or whether you spread it out over 24. So that's why I say, unless you're going to be training within 8 hours when you finish that ride, if you have 24 hours before your next training ride, you can eat carbohydrate throughout that 24 hours and still synthesize glycogen.
Is that the same
So
for protein though, as well?
yes, again, protein synthesis, it has nothing to do with absorption,
Hmm.
what my gut can absorb. It's protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis it's stimulated so that it's most active right after you finish exercising and within 2 hours. So when they've done research studies where they look only within a 2 hour window, they see this really high rate of muscle protein synthesis. But when they look over 24 hours, it sort of levels out and you'll end up at the same endpoint. So it doesn't hurt to have some protein within 2 hours to augment that muscle protein synthesis rate. But at the end of the day, it's probably going to be the same whether you have it immediately post exercise or over or later. So I wouldn't get too caught up about it. The thing that I find most athletes do really well, and it sounds corny, and I hate to be saying chocolate milk, but I mean, that's got a nice ratio of carbs to protein. A lot of people can drink some of it right after. Also doing some sort of protein shake, or like if you like things like Ensure or muscle milk or Gator Load or something that you can drink post exercise, that's a good way to go as well.
I know we have
But
some cyclists that likes to do back-to-back ultra endurance events in this case. So it may not be within the next 8 hours, but they are having to do another century in the next 24 hours. I guess in terms of those recommendations, if they can eat on the bike, that's where they could continue to get more of their carbs and nutrition, but also their post meal is also important as well.
yeah, and for somebody that's doing a back-to-back ultra, then I would absolutely say you should be trying to consume as much as you can when you finish the first one. Just because you have a short period of time and you don't want to have to load up real heavy a few hours before you start the next one. So you're best to do it as quickly as you can post so that you can get it in and you're not feeling like bloated and overfed the 2 hours before you have to start the next one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we're getting close on time, so probably just a couple more questions. That's next one here is I interval train and try not to eat anything before as it makes my stomach upset, but afterwards I'm completely depleted and can't eat enough. Can you suggest something to eat before and after?
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with I need to know when the interval training is happening. Again, if you're going to do your interval training first thing in the morning after you've eaten well the night before, then eating something very light is going to give you what you need. As long as if you're feeling really depleted afterwards, then congratulations, you had a great training session, right? Depleted. If you're feeling depleted before you get to the end of your interval training, then there's a problem. But if you feel depleted at the end, I would say high five, congratulations, you did what you should have. But if you're you're hitting the wall before, or you're running out of energy before you finish your interval training session, then you probably need to think back to what you had going into it. So if having something before you go into your training bout is hard, then load heavy the night before, so at least your muscle glycogen is topped off, and then have something light. I tend to focus on bananas. Those work really well for me. Whatever works really well for you that's light. And then trying to eat little bits during the ride, which I know is harder with intervals, but that's where having like a chew or something that you can kind of chew on real easily, maybe a sports drink, something that you can sip on that's not going to overload your stomach all at once.
Okay, let's do one more question. I think I have time for one more question. This is about the difference between gels and chews. Is it okay to use gels and chews for most of my calories during a long event, or should I be eating real food as well?
Yeah. It doesn't matter. As long as you're getting the 30 to 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate, do it however you want to do it. So if gels and chews are your go-to and you've found some gels and some chews that you like, go with those. If you prefer to have real food, go with that. If you want to mix it up, do that as well. So it's really completely what you find palatable, what you find convenient, what your stomach can tolerate. As long as it's meeting the right macros and you're getting.
I was gonna mention the macro requirements. If they're eating a steak on the bike, that's probably not the best meal to eat, even though they enjoy it. But as you mentioned, as long as they're meeting their macro requirement nutrients.
I want to see that. I want to see somebody like.
Rick, could I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Phil.
Kathie, looking at your distribution chart for percentage of protein, carbohydrates, fat, whatever. So I go along with or do the about 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And what I'm wondering is if you're doing a really 100-mile ride or something like that, and you burn 4,000 calories or so, if you just did the 1.8 grams per kilogram of protein, that wouldn't be 15 to 20% of your intake. So what's more important here? Should you just stick to the 1.8 grams per kilogram and float the rest in carbohydrates, or what?
So on a day like that, where you're consuming 4,000 calories and assuming you're meeting your carbohydrate requirements, so, if you're up doing 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate and you still have calories left over, then it's kind of like, and you're getting adequate fat and you're getting your essential fatty acids, then where are you going to add to it? Then you can bump your protein up for sure. And so it's kind of you have to kind of play with the macros a little bit. But since you only have 3 to work with, assuming you're meeting your carbohydrate requirements and you're getting adequate fat, then yeah, I would just boost protein up on that day.
Okay.
And you could go up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. You just probably wouldn't want to do it all the time, because what happens is if you overdo it on protein, it's going to take away from carbs. So as long as you're meeting your carbs, and you have calories left over, you got to get those calories somehow. So if it's a choice between adding more fat, assuming you're getting plenty of fat, and adding more protein, I would say add more protein
Yeah,
all the time.
good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Following on from that, if you were to have too much protein, is there a negative there other than probably gaining weight?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to gain weight with extra protein. It's not that it can't happen, but if you're going to consume excess calories, protein is your best excess calorie to choose, because For protein, once you've met your protein requirements for muscle protein synthesis and tissue synthesis and all of that, then protein has two options. It can be used to synthesize carbohydrate, but if you're getting adequate carbohydrate, it's not going to go that route. So then it's going to be converted to fat and you'll store it. But it's an energy expensive process to do that. So the body is really going to try to find a use for protein in some other way than to convert it to fat and store it. So if I've got an athlete that's going to like overeat on something, I would say choose protein every time to overeat on, because you're less likely to gain excess weight overeating on protein than on the other macronutrients. You're going to be more likely to gain excess weight overeating on fat, assuming calorie levels are met. Second, carbohydrate, last is protein. So
That's a good point. So it's a slow pathway.
it's an inefficient pathway, very inefficient.
Okay.
And the body likes to be efficient, right? The body does not like inefficiencies. So
Oh, look at a donut and you gain weight.
it's really hard to gain weight on salmon.
Yeah, and I like salmon. I eat it a lot.
So we're running time. So I wanted to thank you, Kathie, Bill, and Oren, for joining us today. And I think this is a really good discussion. For the folks that are watching this, hopefully you enjoyed as well. As a caveat, please take the discussions and viewpoints here as only for entertainment purposes. And if you are considering changing your diet or you need medical advice, please consult a professional. Kathie, do you have a contact information that you wanted to pass on to people?
Let me go to the end. We'll have to get to some of the other stuff on our next.
We will have to get, yes. Well, yes.
So there is my email, which is the easiest to reach me. And yeah, any questions that your members might have.
Amazing. Thank you so much, folks. Hope folks enjoyed it.